everyone. Welcome to the event today, leveraging the Okanagan Charter to bounce forward from the major crises of our time. My name is Jennifer McCorston, and I'm the Associate Director of Health Promotion and Campus Wellness at the University of Waterloo, and I'm acting as your MC today. So I'm located in Waterloo region in Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee's people, and the land is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. So we're happy to have you spending the next couple hours with us on this very important topic. We had over 450 registrants, so obviously a topic that really resonates with a lot of people working in post-secondary institutions. And we have a really exciting event with staff and students and a keynote speaker on collective impact. So before I hand it over to President Santa Ono for welcoming remarks, I just have a couple housekeeping items to run through with you. You'll notice there's a Zoom chat box on the side, so feel free to say hello in that and share where you're joining today. And a Zoom chat box is really a powerful dialogue tool. So if you have questions or comments throughout the event, please feel free to put them in there, and others, please respond to them. We won't be taking formal questions through the chat box, but that's where we encourage other participants on the line to respond and to share their feedback. And at the end, we'll have a Mentimeter poll as well. Then this will be an opportunity to engage you on the line with your thoughts. So I really encourage you to respond, and we'll be sharing those responses back later. So the event is being recorded, and you can find the recording on the UBC Wellbeing YouTube channel, and the link will also be embedded on the event webpage. But if you'd like to remove your name from the Zoom event as it's published, you can click over the participants list, hover over your name, and click on rename, and you will be removed. So we have many amazing speakers joining us today, and in the interest of time, we're not going to be doing formal introductions, but instead I invite you to check out their bios on our webpage, and we'll pop that in the chat box soon. So now I'm going to hand it over to someone who's an avid cello player, but also a champion for well-being, equity, inclusion, and sustainability. So I'm going to hand it over to UBC's President Santa Ono.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction. And I just want to, on behalf of the University of British Columbia, the University of Waterloo, and McGill University, and the Canadian Health Promoting Campus Network, I'd like to welcome all of you to this exciting event. There's so many people that are participating today, and we couldn't be more thrilled with the interest in today's event. I'm delighted to be able to join you today from the unceded traditional territory, the ancestral territory of Musqueam First Nation here in Vancouver, British Columbia. Institutions such as the ones I've mentioned, UBC, Waterloo, and McGill, face complex issues around health and well-being, especially in these times of COVID, which is a global pandemic, as you know, and the climate emergency that we're all dealing with, and a renewed urgency to address systemic racism for Indigenous, Black, and other people of color. So there's a lot on our plate as a society, and there's a lot that universities can do to lead, to make the world a better place with respect to these issues. Today, we'll delve into conversations that explore how institutions can approach human rights, well-being, and sustainability in a unified way that advances all of these 3 social change agendas. If you really think about it, the world needs universities now more than ever before. And the world needs all of the members of our communities, especially the students, to be involved, to pave the way for a better future. We simply cannot address well-being without addressing equity. We can't address well-being without addressing the climate emergency. We cannot address well-being without figuring out what we're doing with this pandemic and future pandemics. These issues are deeply interconnected and need to be addressed together. This is not easy work, but it is critical if we want to make the necessary changes to our systems and to our culture well beyond the boundaries of our campuses. Universities have tremendous influence, and we need to step up as a sector to really address this issue. It's our hope collectively that engaging in this dialogue in an intentional way will provide us with the insights, tools, and connections. This is a virtual network. Let's grasp this and embrace it and continue to work together well beyond today so that we can fast track action in these areas in a way that moves societal change beyond intention and into everyday practice and results. One of the powerful tools that can help guide this work is the Okanagan Charter for health promoting universities and colleges. And there is a wave of interest in embracing this charter around the world. And that's why we're here today. The Okanagan Charter provides us with a common language, principles, and a very important framework to address these pressing, thorny problems. And it calls on higher education, on us, to embed health into everyday operations, businesses and practices and academic mandates. It has to be threaded throughout everything that we do as educational institutions. We need to lead in health promotion, action, and collaboration. These problems are so large that none of us, no single institution, no single province or state, no single nation can solve them on their own. We have to come together to achieve success against the most difficult problems the world has ever faced. In June of 2015, UBC co-hosted the International Conference on Health Promoting Universities and Colleges at the Okanagan campus, bringing participants together from 45 countries, representing educational institutions and health organizations, including powerhouses such as the World Health Organization and UNESCO. That's the kind of collaboration and alignment that we need as a world to address these issues. Over 3 days, these organizations collaborated on the development of the Okanagan Charter. With the support of the Canadian Health Promoting Campus Network, the Charter has now been adopted by 22 institutions, and more are waiting to sign on. And many of you are listening to this webinar, thinking about how you can be part of this powerful network. UBC was one of the first 6 universities in the world to adopt a charter in 2015. This commitment sends a powerful message about the type of institution we all are. One institutions that excel in teaching, learning, and research, and recognizing that with the privileges that we enjoy as great institutions, that with that comes a responsibility to support the well-being not only of people in our universities, but those that have never set foot on our campuses. We have that responsibility. We have that opportunity. At UBC, we know that to support the well-being of people and places, we need to also take serious action, as I mentioned, to address these root causes of the threats that we all face to our well-being. The climate emergency. We know from talking to students, faculty, and staff that they are worried about the future of this planet. We have to address systemic racism inside our campuses and outside, because we train the leaders of the future. And the better job we do about talking about the truth of racism and what it's going to take to address it, the better chance we have as a society to get at that insidious problem that doesn't go away, and that is racism. UBC is committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are holistic, ranging everything from good health and well-being all the way to climate change. The SDGs really encompass and provide a roadmap for all of us to embrace and rally around. In 2019, the UBC Board of Governors unanimously endorsed a declaration on the climate emergency, and many institutions have done so. But we've established a climate emergency task force comprised of students, because they really were the spark plug of everything that's happening, if you really think about it. There could be and should be no ageism in our approach. Faculty and staff have been included. This task force led an extensive community engagement process and will be presenting recommendations to the Board of Governors in the near future. The recommendations will be considered in the context of UBC's overall strategic plan, our Indigenous strategic plan, which was just approved, our climate action plan, which has just been renewed, and our inclusion action plan, which has just been presented to the university community. Because we know we can't address these things separately. They really have to be intertwined. And there has to be alignment in how we approach these issues as single institutions, but also as a sector and as a world. UBC is also taking steps to address issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, as is happening on all of our campuses, to identify and address gaps in supporting racialized students, faculty, and staff, and addressing issues of representation in each of those different parts of the university. This past summer, we committed to tackling the pervasiveness of systemic racism and to accelerate this additional emergency, to intensify our efforts to build a more inclusive campus community. This included creating a new position, a senior advisor to me on race and inclusive excellence. The university is also continuing to work actively on a wide range of institutional initiatives guided by our Inclusion Action Plan, which is intersections with the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan. Each of these areas, well-being, climate change, and inclusion, call for complex societal change. And culture change is the most difficult thing for us to achieve in our institutions and in the world. But let's face it, this pandemic that is an unprecedented challenge has heightened the urgency to address these issues that are the focus of today's dialogue. They have accentuated the disparities that exist that are unacceptable. So the time to act is now. To kick off our event, we have the privilege of hearing from 3 students from whom we will learn, who will share their perspective. Because what we do is setting the stage for a better world for them. May this help us keep the student experience and perspective at the center of everything that we do. That's why universities exist. That's the primary purpose, is to listen and to help form the leaders of tomorrow. Today we have some of those students with us. Please welcome Zabeen Kamisha, Anjali Mishra, and Temi Onifade. Start with Zabeen, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here and for being willing to share your lived experience. My question for you today is this. As a student, this is for all 3 of you, why do you think it's important for higher education institutions to make well-being, equity, and the climate emergency top priorities right now? Zabeen?
Thank you so much. It's a great question. I think it really, my response is really in reflection to a lot of the comments you've already made. I think the root of this question is understanding what role the university has in the public good. What relationship do we have in the community? I think that's a long stemming question, a long legacy of efforts by students, faculty, staff, and in the academy to push this as a priority. I think I guess the idea would be that now is always important, has always been important. If anything, as you've mentioned, the pandemic is really an opportunity for us to consider the urgency behind these concerns and how they're interconnected in the community, and that we have to acknowledge we are part of the community and that we have to hold ourselves accountable in the same way that other institutions in our community have to be held accountable. And I think with the pandemic, when we consider the role of the university and the experience of students, if we're not in the institution itself right now in classrooms because of the pandemic, what value does the university actually have right now? And I think if we don't involve ourselves in the community, if we don't limit that barrier between our university walls and the communities that we live in. I think that's a huge disservice to anybody, and education and knowledge and the production of knowledge. I think at the same time, we really have to consider the spirit of care and a new networked economy, and being able to value the fact that our institution is made up of people who care, and people who have relationships with one another. So for me, the idea of urgency now, it's acknowledging that we haven't done this in the past. We, as the academy, we've played a role in colonial attitudes and reinforcing neoliberal capitalist agendas. And if we don't address this now, the university will not be resilient enough and contribute enough to the future. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And I've just been listening to you and thinking about the phrase, if not now, when? So let's do this now. Thank you, Sabine. Anjali?
Thank you, Dr. Ono. Thank you, Sabine. It was great to hear from you. I think for me, why we need to prioritize these issues really comes down to hope. And to make this really personal right now, during the pandemic, there have been moments where I felt really hopeless. I've been isolated from my community. I've been isolated from other students, able to convene and take action on the issues that matter most to me. And in doing so, I felt so disconnected. Disconnected not only from people, but my larger sense of purpose. There have been days where I feel like I've completely lost the plot, and I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I don't know why I'm studying what I'm studying, because it seems so futile in this face of the world that we're looking at. I'm not alone in this. Just last week, I was speaking to a friend who recently transferred to UBC, and he feels so alone and disconnected. He doesn't know why he's studying right now, because what he's learning in the classroom is so different from the pain of his present reality. And I don't know if he'll come back to UBC next semester or even next year. So when we're thinking about addressing racism, colonialism, and the climate crisis, what I really see us doing is addressing that which stifles hope. It is so directly an issue of well-being. When we're addressing these issues, we're addressing the very reason why so many of us students come to university in the first place. Like, I really don't see a reason of studying our world when that world isn't what I want to live in. I so appreciate this conversation about focusing on equity, the human rights of Indigenous peoples, and addressing the climate crisis as priorities within our institutions, but I really feel like they need to be the priority. And I'll turn it to you, Dr. Ono, and other administrators, staff, faculty, community members on this call. Why did you get involved in this work in the first place? I genuinely want to believe that it's because you wanted to make a difference, to create a better world, one that is just and sustainable. So why make these issues priorities? A, because it's the right thing to do. B, because it'll give students like me a renewed sense of hope and purpose. But lastly, because it aligns with the reason why you're doing all of the work that you're doing, and making universities places that don't just do research and teaching in silos, but are actively involved in the creation of a just, sustainable world, which ought to be what modern universities are doing. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. But Anjali, just offline, if you could reach out to me, I'd love to talk to that student that you mentioned, because we want that student to stay. And there have been articles that I've been participating in recently. You probably have seen them regarding the fact that we're very cognizant of the fact that hope is an issue. There was an article that came out in the National Post and more recently in the Toronto Star. So certainly this is something that I'm actively working on. And I'd love to talk to you more offline, and as well as to that student. So thank you so much for that. Temi?
Thanks so much for the question and the great answers. So to set the tone for my answer, I want to say that we know by research that climate emergency impacts well-being, equity, Indigenous, Black, and other colored communities. The impacts are really global. So recently I was reading an article on Rolling Stone about how climate change is ushering in a new pandemic era. Pandemics are, of course, not the only climate problem we face, but it's the most relevant right now. The author of that article, Jeff Whittle, explains that a deadly mosquito called Aedes aegypti, which causes dengue fever, found its way to Florida in the US. It's safe to suggest that mosquitoes and diseases are not left out of globalization. So by 2080, one recent study estimated more than 6 billion people, or 60% of the world's population, will be at risk for dengue. There are several other ecosystem disruptions and emerging consequences arising from global warming and climate change. So let's imagine the impact these disruptions and consequences will have on poor communities with limited access to healthcare. Least developed countries and Indigenous and immigrant communities, industrialized countries, including Canada, are more vulnerable. Ironically, these places and peoples have contributed the least to climate change historically. But take notice, some of these places are catching up in their contribution and will impact climate change the most in the future. So for instance, studies have shown that unlike industrialized countries with stable population and locked-in infrastructures, developing countries, for instance, Africa, where I am from, they have the highest rising population and will be the industrial continent of the future. So as someone from there, I know the industrialization will be dirty and cause more climate change. I've worked in the Niger Delta, and I can tell you for sure the industrialization won't be clean. So to answer the question, why should our education institutions make well-being, equity, Indigenous peoples' human rights, and climate emergency a priority? Well, climate emergency is the most fundamental problem. We already know that we need to reduce emissions drastically by 2030. If we fail to do so, we will then have to depend on unreliable and largely unpredictable technologies, and will be unable to reverse some impacts that can cause more problems in the future. So we need all hands on deck. However, unlike governments that must address and sometimes balance interests of stakeholders in society, and businesses that may need to answer to their shareholders, pursue profits, higher institutions can experiment, and the cost of failure is not as serious, right? After all, experiments fail all the time. So there are already many university programs seeking to address climate change. I'm involved in some of them in Canada and the UK, Canada Climate Law Initiative, New Institute Network for Africa, Climate Hub at UBC, and the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative at Oxford. So these types of projects are channels for universities to tackle climate change, to use as a bridge into vulnerable communities. But there are so many others. So I think now is the time to act if we don't want to get into trouble. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Temi. I hope everybody listening can see why starting with the students and their perspective is the right way to start this dialogue. I want to thank all of you for a very powerful commentary and a call to action for all of us to really focus the priorities of the institution to address these issues. To Temi's point, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take everyone in the institution to really think about how to realign what we do in terms of our scholarship, what happens in the classroom, so that students feel hope, so that there's reason for us all to have hope. But in addition to that, it's going to require that we work together, that Waterloo and McGill and UBC, and I see people participating from the US and all over the world on this call, which is really heartening. But let's commit today to make those significant interactions. There are a couple of organizations, the last thing I'll say, that just to illustrate the opportunity. I'm the head of something called the University Climate Change Coalition, or UC3. There's 20-something universities in North America that are coming together with a strategic and research plan to actually address climate change. It's going to require more than that 22 universities. There's a bigger one called U7+, which are really universities around the world that are coming together. We just met about a week and a half ago. That's what it's going to take. But it's not going to just take the presidents getting together. That's not going to solve the problem at all. Or just the faculty. It's going to require students coming together. And I'm going to tell you, in those organizations, the students are the catalyst. So I want to thank all of you for that very, very important launch and kickoff to this dialogue. Now I'd like to hand it over to our keynote speaker, Sylvia Chu, Consulting Director of the Tamarack Institute's Collective Impact Idea Area. And as I've been saying, this is all about collective impact. Thank you very much. Sylvia?
Thanks so much, Dr. Ono, and the panel. You have totally filled my head and my heart with giving us a compelling reason and focus for this conversation. You know, I come to this call today not as someone embedded in a university, but what I look at and see when I look at universities is in so many ways you are a microcosm of the broader community. And I truly believe that if you are able to experiment and find creative ways to tackle these major issues simultaneously, that you will be and can be a catalyst for a profound global change by the examples that you create. I am not an expert in the topics that have been brought forward today. What I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about is how, given the focus of the issues you want to address, how do you begin to structure yourselves and to think about working together in interesting ways to advance from ideas to action? So if we can go to the first slide. Those of you who know nothing about Tamarack, we are a Canadian national charity that really focuses on what does it take to make lasting community change happen. And as I've been doing this work for more than 20 years in a variety of different capacities, I've really zeroed in and I'm starting to reevaluate and rethink how we do tackle change on a range of complex issues, not the least of which are climate, the COVID response, equity, and the human rights of Indigenous people. There are 5 things that are starting to evolve and shift in my own thinking about how we come together to do this kind of work. The first is we need to move beyond organizations and institutions and really look to creating multi-sectoral networks and use those networks to build and serve as catalysts for a broader movement of change, for change. That a recognition that we need to look not only at programmatic solutions, but also to be thinking about systems change. And what are the barriers that we have created? What are the actions that we are currently doing unintentionally that are helping to hold these problems in place? And how can we own the leadership to shift those? I do think we need to rethink what leadership looks like, where we have shared collaborative leadership rooted in trusted relationships to really untie some of these complex knots in front of us. I think we need to also not run away from the complexity and the scale, but focus on simple rules to guide our actions and focusing on making change in ways that we can influence, trusting and knowing that these learnings will create cascades of positive difference. And lastly, I think we need to come together and find new ways to reimagine the challenge in front of us so that we are moving beyond debate and we are looking and challenging how we simultaneously accomplish powerful things by looking at issues of equity and human rights along with these other challenges and not put ourselves into false dichotomies. On to the next slide. So the first, I'm going to actually talk about 2 interesting frameworks for how people organize themselves to tackle complex issues together. The first being collective impact, which is a very disciplined form of multi-sector collaboration that really came to the forefront in 2011 and subsequently has been evaluated and proven to be an effective framework for mobilizing and advancing high impact change on a range of complex issues. If we can go to the next slide, you will see that this framework has 5 core elements to it The key for you all right now is to build this shared vision for change, which is the common agenda that is owned and committed to by a diverse network of people. The Okanagan Charter is a beautiful container for this kind of work. But beyond that aspiration, you also need to bring these multi-sector leaders together to say, what is it that we are committing to take action around in a shared and coordinated way to advance positive change on this agenda? There's lots to be said and shared about each one of these 5, and I think the importance and value of the collective impact framework is it offers folks a roadmap of the key elements that you need to be paying attention to design an infrastructure to mobilize your work. On to the next slide. My colleagues Liz Weaver and Mark Cabage in 2016 stepped back and looked at how collective impact was being taken and mobilized and on a range of complex issues. And they wrote a paper called Collective Impact 3.0. But just to sort of set the stage for understanding this, you know, historically, the organization has been the mechanism that we have relied on to advance action on a range of different things. What collective impact as a framework offers is for these individual organizations and institutions to adopt a shared management paradigm for how they tackle these issues together. The evolution in collective impact proposed initially by my colleagues at Tamarack suggests that yes, the bones of collective impact as an approach are roughly right, but to really get to the full promise of what this framework offers, we need to bring into this work the notion of a movement building paradigm. So what does that mean? Yes, we need a common agenda, a shared vision, but it needs to be rooted deeply in community aspiration. We need to have shared measurement, absolutely, but why? In support of our own strategic learning so that we are continually deepening our understanding and appreciation of the issues that we're hoping to impact. And mutually reinforcing activities, absolutely. So there's a coordination and orchestration of action across different players in the system, but with a real emphasis and lens on being high leveraged and focusing on systems change. We need authentic, ongoing community engagement so that this work is owned not just by us, leaders and catalysts, but by every single human being with whom we touch and who learns about the work we're advancing. And lastly, part of the leader's job in this work is to create a broad container to welcome and mobilize community change. And that is truly how we will advance agendas on these tough issues. If you can go to the next slide. So for me, this paradigm shift to building a movement with a framework like collective impact really focuses on transformation. It's not just about improving our existing systems, but what do we fundamentally have to reimagine? It is about thinking and working alongside community and the leadership and the untapped resources and skills that is nested within it. And it is about disciplining ourselves to stand still in spite of the urgency, to determine where we're going to find leverage before we go racing off into action. And lastly, it's also about recognizing and humanizing the fact that this kind of work challenges the paradigms that many have been holding. And so how do we advocate but do it with empathy so that we are compassionate and mutually supportive of people who are having to make this change journey happen on their own as well? Next, please. I do want to really emphasize the importance of not just looking at programmatic solutions, but really looking and moving towards thinking about systems change as well. My friend Karen Pittman from the Forum for Youth Investment nails it, right? A program intervention helps people to beat the odds, but systemic interventions seek to change the odds for everyone. So yes, we need high quality programs that are well aligned to support our goals for change. And we also need to be very intentional about building strategies to shift the systems that are contributing to the issue. On to the next, please. Together with Peter Senge, the folks at FSG in 2018 have done a bit of a deeper dive into understanding the dimensions of what we're engaging with when we're talking about uncovering and addressing systemic barriers, with the overarching question of what are we doing in our day-to-day actions that are helping to hold this problem stuck. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a bit of a deeper dive into each one. Oops, sorry, maybe not. Into each one of those layers, the 6. So the surface stuff that's very explicit and easy to monitor are policy changes, practice changes, and resource flows. But underneath that, and subtly important and critically important, are also about building new relationships and connections and being willing to shift power dynamics, because ultimately we need to change the behaviors and assumptions and mental models that we're all holding, because that's how we'll know that we've made it to the change we're hoping to see. Next slide. The late Brenda Zimmerman, I think, has brilliantly identified one of the biggest challenges we have to be aware of is this pressure for snapback. What you all are calling on is to be pioneers of new, innovative ways of tackling some of our most intractable issues and doing it in a comprehensive and complementary way. And there's going to be lots of energy and enthusiasm, but there will always be temptations to go back to the same old way of doing things, even though we know it doesn't work. But the good thing to remember is that there are some strategies. We can anticipate that the system will want to stay as it is, and that as people in the system, we will have times when we ourselves want to go back to the old way of doing things. And so knowing that that's a likely outcome at some point, there are some strategies and roadmaps for how we might navigate that. And they are there. Okay, on to the next. Lastly, I want to frame out a second approach that's really energizing me in how I think about this kind of work, and that is called multisolving. It comes from the work of Climate Interactive, and they have this beautiful framework that you see there called the flower. What it's actually asking us to do is to not dodge the complexity, and to say we shouldn't be forced into a choice of do we improve healthcare or do we improve the climate. The answer is both. And so the challenge for all of us is how do we look for opportunities to generate multiple benefits in terms of climate, in terms of health, in terms of equity, human rights, the economy, while in a very holistic way. It invites us to pool our expertise and our funding and our political will and try and see how to address these multiple problems with a single investment of time and money. If we can go to the next slide. What I love about this model is it allows us to also map where are we. You'll see climate might be the primary focus, but how do we do our climate mitigation work in a way that creates jobs for those in need, in a way that promotes well-being and health, in a way that encourages and builds more social connections between and amongst people. That's the kind of challenge. And what they ask with this model is to also pay attention to who benefits. So if you are doing work in climate that is simultaneously enhancing health and well-being for folks, if the primary beneficiaries are those that are already well off, we color it dark. If the primary beneficiaries are those who are more vulnerable and marginalized, we note that by making the perimeter dark. So it's a way of helping us to see and work together around how we act. If you can go to the next slide. I know that Transform TO really embraced this multi-solving concept in how they began to adapt and refine their strategy to get to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And part of the reason why they did that was when they went out to community was very open to working alongside them around the climate mitigation strategies and goals. But they had key questions for these folks, many representatives from the city. How is this going to help me find a job? How is this going to help me feed my kids at the end of the week? And they realized that they couldn't be single siloed in their thinking because ordinary people don't live single sector issues and lives. On to the next. So what you'll see is how, while they went out with a climate-only focus and saw their goal as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, embracing multi-solving and the voice of the community led them to reframe what they saw as their mission and mandate. How do we mobilize diverse community intelligence and resources to address local priorities and at the same time contribute to an equitable low carbon city? Okay, on to the next. So what you'll see, they have come into these three elements and they have really become aware and convinced that you can achieve emission reductions, and at the same time you need to be sensitive to and champion community priorities. And it's possible and necessary to do these at the same time. Okay, on to the next. So lessons, key lessons. Don't really focus on embracing that diversity and challenging ourselves to think creatively about simultaneously. Residents will always view these issues in a much more holistic way than traditionally we might if we come from a single sector or single siloed sort of perspective as a subject matter expert. So be really mindful and aware of that and the value of both types of thinking. And that, I love this quote from Elizabeth Solomon of Climate Interactive. I believe that systems shift most effectively when change is happening at multiple levels with some sort of loose congruence. I also believe that change is held back when we put too much effort on focusing on shifting a single layer of the system while other layers may be frozen in place or actively working against us. So for me, this is also about standing still and noticing where are the movements that are building already in support of what you're trying to achieve, and how do you become aware of them and align with efforts that may be happening at different scales. Next slide, please. Just quickly, a couple of little examples. This is how the city of Lethbridge has taken that concept of the flower from multi-solving and really broadened it out using the 15 different dimensions that they have embraced around social development and well-being. So you can take this and push yourselves to think more holistically. On to the next. And then here's the city of Kitchener, who has embraced the UN Sustainable Development Goals as core to how they do the planning across the city as a whole, absolutely recognizing that you have, if you want to build a healthy, vibrant, and inclusive city and or community for everyone, it must be rooted in the Sustainable Development Goals, because it helps us to address multiple issues holistically. So there are others already doing this work as well that you can align with and mobilize. Okay, on to the next. Lastly, just want to do a bit of a shout out again for the folks at Climate Interactive, because I've noticed they have now created their great database. They call it Green, Resilient, and Equitable Actions for Transformation. So they are starting to create a bit of a inventory of plans at different scales, some approved, some in development, that address issues of COVID, economic recovery, equity, and human rights and climate change, all in one go. All right, so there you go, folks. Hope this contributes pieces to your thinking and gives you some thoughts and ideas about not just what you're focused on, but how you organize yourselves to have huge impact on these critical issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks for that overview of collective impact. If that was new to people, and thinking about how we leverage our resources and collectively work towards common goals at post-secondary institutions. So now I'm going to hand it over to our panel of staff who are going to build on Sylvia's discussion. Each of them specializes in a specific area, but we've invited them to be part of this panel because they all understand the connections and they work in their own respective institutions to really connect the areas. So they're going to share their wisdom with us. So on our panel today, we have Angela Campbell, Ainsley Carey, Grace Nozick, and Matt Tyson. So I'm going to let them pop up all on the screen there. And I'm going to kick it off by putting forward the first question for the discussion. So how can universities approach human rights, well-being, equity, and sustainability in a way that advances all of our agendas? And maybe I'll hand it over to Ainsley to kick it off for us.
Well, Jennifer, thanks for that question and for starting us off. I'd also like to take a second to compliment President Ono for his leadership and the panel of students that started us off today. I really think they set the tone for today's conversation, and they really exemplify what we are here to talk about today. And in response to this specific question, universities have a dire responsibility to help center this conversation. And part of moving human rights forward, well-being, and sustainability can be centered at universities taking action collectively. I would think in direct response to this question, it begins with listening. As Santa mentioned, listening to students and listening to our communities around us. Because many of the students who are on many of our campuses are coming from different places all over the world. And they are bringing to our university that diversity of thought, diversity of idea, but also diversity of challenges. So if we took the time to listen to our students, we'll actually get a pretty good sample of what's going on around the world and where students are most impacted and affected, and where communities that we care about are impacted and affected. So listening, to start off, is critically important. I also think listening with a center and an ear toward well-being. One of the most important things our students and our parents look for when they bring their students to university is how are we taking care of their students? I remember the days where parents were concerned about whether Johnny would pass a class or not. I remember the days when parents were concerned about whether he would be able to make friends. That remains a concern. But more important than anything else, parents are concerned about our health and well-being and the university's infrastructure to manage these things. How are we taking care of our students? So centering the conversation there is critically important. But last but not least, how do we make this work? We have to start taking action. There's a lot of listening going on. There's a lot of consultation going on. We're doing a lot of good scholarly work on all of these topics. But universities have to find a way to influence the political process and begin taking action. And then holding ourselves accountable, our stakeholders accountable, and then reporting back on what's working and what's not working. And when we find places where we made mistakes, we come back and we heal that community and we apologize and we learn how we can do it well moving forward. But it all begins with listening, a sincere and deep listening that is centered on well-being and centered on taking action. I think many of my colleagues here would also like to reflect on that idea. Matt or Grace or Angela?
I can jump in. I love that. I've loved this focus on students. I am a student and I am the founder and student director of the Climate Hub at UBC, which has been mentioned by a couple other folks, including Temi. And I think it's such an incredible example of multi-solving and universities really taking seriously the commitment to engage with students and let them lead on climate justice and let them do these other things. And so just to give you a sense of why the hub is so focused on multi-solving or kind of what our mandate is, we have these pillars that we work to. And our first pillar is justice, always, that climate is the biggest human rights issue of our time. It particularly disproportionately impacts Indigenous peoples, as we're talking about today, but they're also on the front lines of working for climate justice and have been for decades, centuries. And so we also focus on joyful community, really building deep commitment and relationship between students and staff and faculty, but particularly between students right now at this moment, because we believe that knowing people and feeling anchored is the climate work, that the more you feel embedded in community, the more hopeful you feel, the more empowered you feel, the more you'll be able to take things on. We also focus on agency and hope in very particularly. All of our programming weaves those themes in, and systems change over individual change, because we've seen lots of groups working on recycling and shorter showers and these other things, which are not unimportant. But there are very few groups focusing on actually, how do you do civic engagement? How do you call your representatives? How do you support land defenders? How do you build movements around things? And teaching students how to do that is this just incredible watershed moment. And lots of them already come in knowing how to do it too, and they teach us. So that's so cool. And I study the fossil fuel industry, so I know that a lot of the times when we're having these conversations, they've set the table to focus on individual responsibility, away from systems change, away from civic engagement, really on recycling as the answer to this problem. And so where better than at universities to say, actually, we're going to come at this in a totally different, transformative way. And then finally, storytelling, just how important, again, ideas are to this conversation, that listening and then telling the stories, and who are the storytellers, and how are we telling these? So we have a whole program where our university students go out and facilitate climate justice stories at high schools across Metro Vancouver and Canada, and hopefully expanding beyond that, but to bring those principles to young people, to feel hopeful, to feel empowered, to feel like they know how to speak to their community and ask them to take on this systems change together in an intergenerational way. So I have been incredibly impressed, because the hub is this unique thing where students lead it, and they get to shape the direction, but it's funded by UBC. There's a real serious commitment to funding, and there's administrative support. And so that just allows students, particularly when you think about who can't do things without being paid or getting academic credit for doing them, it's marginalized young folks. So having this place where students get paid, they get academic credit, they get to come up with these ideas on climate justice and have other university stakeholders engage with them as equals, is such an incredible way to take this on. And, you know, we challenge UBC all the time. I mean, UBC has been an incredible, stakeholders have been incredible allies. They've worked with us. They've really championed us, but we're also, you know, we see the different futures that there can be, and we push for them. And we don't always understand how the Byzantine administration works at universities, but that can be a good thing, because we have a completely different idea of how it could be. And sometimes those mental blocks that Sylvia was just talking about, we don't have. And so I just really have to commend President Ono and Wellbeing at UBC and Ainsley for really supporting us and giving us that power, even though we make it harder for the university in many ways. They really have genuinely committed to giving students a real seat at the table again and again. I'll let Matt and Angela continue.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in really quickly. I really like picking up on what Ainsley was talking about with the idea of listening. And I think, especially as in staff roles, once you listen, then you need to talk about it as well and bring that conversation forward. And I just look at, you know, how do we make that conversation present at every level of the university, in staff meetings in your own department, at the board or at Senate or at other university governance bodies. And that can be in simple ways. It can be in reports, in updates, in connecting with strategic initiatives, and making sure that lens is applied to everything. Because otherwise, I think there's that risk of that snapback, right? If you're not hearing about it on a constant basis, you just risk defaulting back to whatever we were doing before. So I love the idea of listening, and I think that has to be front and center. And then we have to act on it and to talk about that ourselves. And it's not enough just to hear students, but to then carry that conversation forward. I'll just pick up too on what Grace noted. I think there is this tension between individual action and systemic change. And I love the point you made on recycling. We actually just recently completed our first climate action plan as a university. And when we went out to the community, recycling, despite it being less than 1% of our carbon footprint, was about 40% of the comments that we got back from the university community on what they can do and what we can do. And so it just shows on how ingrained that's been, and why it's necessary to step back a little bit and think about what are the big levers that are out there that can actually shift the nature of carbon footprint on our campus or anywhere else. So, just pulling back a little bit to that systems lens is really critical, and not just being bogged down on small and not unimportant, but not always significant action either.
Maybe I'll just add a few things. So I've really appreciated both the content and the way in which the panel has been structured so far. And I really want to commend and thank the students in particular, Temi, Anjali, and Zabine. I think it takes enormous courage to be first after the president of the university, no less, to set us forward. And I just think it's incredible. So I'm in awe of you. I also listened carefully to the points that were made about the real sense of despair that's being communicated. And Anjali's comment about, why I've sort of lost the plot. That really resonated with me. I've heard that a lot from our students, and I get that a lot. So I work on equity at my university, which is McGill. And it's really hard not to feel like you're losing the plot no matter where you're working and what you're doing in this year. I also really appreciated hearing from Sylvia and this idea of almost what sounded to me like an intersectional approach, but not so much of identities, but also thinking through, if I say I work on equity, well, I should also be working on sustainability and wellness, because all of these things are really meshed together. And I felt like that was a really important invitation for all of us to think through how the work that we're doing seems like it's siloed, but it's really not. And we have the potential to kind of reach out and do so much more. I wanted to just comment also on a couple of things. So one is on the systems change. So from my perspective, the issues that are at the core of today's conversation, so sustainability, climate justice, human rights for Indigenous peoples, fundamentally the right to dignity, equity and anti-racism, and thinking just about all of these issues overall and connecting that to wellness. We've always seen that as something kind of on the side of the university's business, right? So the university is about research and teaching, but to my mind, it really can't be that anymore, right? Like these are not add-ons or nice to have ideas. They've got to be fundamentally core to the business of the university. Its business being teaching, research, service, and connection to the community. And our work has to be infused with that ethos, because if it's just sort of nice to have, it's the first thing to fall when there's a crisis. And we see now more than ever that we need that now. So to me, that's been really fundamental. And the last thing I'll say is just going back to the point Ainsley made about listening, right? So the work that we're doing, particularly for those of us who sit in the central administration of the university, it's universities are a place people go to often for answers, right? They don't go to universities, they go for answers and expertise. And the people who are on the receiving end of the questions are not so good at being the ones asking the questions, right? And coming to the conversation from a place of humility and receptivity. So we're used to answering and having all the answers, but that's not the starting point for this conversation. It's blank slate. Like, we actually haven't gotten this right. So it's time for us to stop, giving information and like do some humble listening. So those are the things I wanted to contribute.
Something that came up in this conversation that I'd love to elevate a little bit more and ask all of the panel members to reflect on, this conversation about individual action versus system action. I don't know if the right connector between the two is versus. Remember, it took us decades to get people to start taking individual action, right? Getting people to recycle, getting people to ride their bikes to work, getting people to wash their car less often, getting people to water their lawns less often. Those were decades of conversations to getting people to take individual action. Now suddenly we shift and say, no, that's not important anymore. Now it's about systems action, right? When in fact, it still is important that individuals take those individual actions. So I'm wondering if there's a yes and that complements these two, to say there is individual action that, my 13-year-old daughter can still take without feeling like she has to tackle a system, right? So I'm wondering, how do we make sure that we position individual responsibility in a place that it still holds respect with regard to system action as well, right? And not make people feel like that's no longer important. And I finally started recycling at home, and now you're telling me that's not important anymore. So how do we position those things to make sure that this still feels important? And I know that's not what the panel was saying, but I do get the feeling that people are starting to feel discouraged by their bike riding to
Mhm.
work as their effort to the environment. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think it's comes back to that feeling of hope and the agency that you have to do something. Of course, there's that sense of accomplishment that you can contribute in some way. And I think one of the there's been a lot of good work written on this on climate change and two very seems to be polarized ends of the conversation. But one thing that I absolutely agree, I think it's a yes and we need to do both really well. And you know, individual action on climate anyways is certainly not going to solve the problem. I don't think there's many people that would argue that. But without it, it's kind of that necessary but insufficient condition, because if you don't have the individual action, then you certainly won't have the buy-in for the systemic change, right? It's creating that culture of embracing these things that need to happen at every level. And if you can't convince people to recycle, you're certainly not going to convince them to vote for a carbon tax or vote for other regulations that will have an impact in potentially different ways and potentially more significant ways over time. So yeah, I completely agree. It's not going to be, you know, do the small things and we don't need to worry about that anymore. Flight shaming, I don't know if you've heard, but there's this whole new movement around how do we solve air travel, because that's a significant contributor to climate change. And individual action, you know, it might not be in and of itself, but it makes a signal that people start paying attention to. And that is certainly important.
I'd love to jump in here. This is kind of the intersection of what the Hub does and my research. And we definitely never, ever want to make people feel bad about how they're doing what they're doing. That's a terrible tactic. But I think we are shifting what you can do with 1 hour of your time. And I wrote a whole op-ed about this in the CBC, that voting, if you're going to spend an hour trying to decide what LED light bulb to get in a store and feeling that paralyzing, which one is the right, how am I doing this, versus voting and then asking 5 or 10 other people to vote. To me, there's no question in the scope and the power, or supporting land vendors or looking up Indigenous language in that hour. And so the Hub has been reframing it from the 3 R's to the 3 V's: vote, volunteer, and voice your concerns to friends and family, as things that every single person can do and is important to in the movement. And Wellbeing actually supported us in making a whole video around this, combined with sports and athletes talking about their comebacks compared to climate comeback and what do we do, and having these 3 V's. I think what's important to remember is, like, recycling is covered. Every group ever, every textbook ever has this, and the social science shows that this is what people see environmental citizenship to be. And so I think university is starting to say, actually, environmental citizenship is supporting Indigenous sovereignty, is knowing how civic society works and what the lever points are. And so we're actually going to create a civic engagement boot camp where we show students the policies that they care about from any discipline, how you would take that policy into action. And, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I'm biased, but when we tackled smoking, we did ask people to quit. We created those, but the things that shifted, and this is so clear, is when we started mandating where you could smoke, who was impacted by secondhand smoke, and who is seeding the ideas that we're framing and playing on. And with smoking, it was the tobacco industry. They spent billions of dollars trying to block regulation and individual action. And we're facing that same thing on climate and COVID and Indigenous rights, which are deeply intertwined. There just was a blockbuster report that the fossil fuel industry has been pushing recycling as the answer for the last 30 years, even though they knew it wasn't environmentally or economically feasible. BP came up with a carbon calculator and pushed it into schools to think about what is my fault? What am I doing? And I just think reframing this as, we have not made the choices that created this problem, particularly young people. Don't feel guilty about this. Feel hope and come together with your peers to face this existential threat. It can actually be the most meaningful thing that you do. You can build your deepest friendships. You can build your deepest connections. And so we do that by having a community chat every single week. run by different members of the community. We really try to spotlight and highlight marginalized voices who wouldn't otherwise get to do that. And truly, the only focus of that hour is just to get to know each other and speak vulnerably and put our guard down. And particularly now, as there's these freshmen or first years who have never met anyone else, to get to have that moment. And it's also a space where men can be vulnerable and speak about these different things, because we haven't mentioned it, but obviously toxic masculinity is woven deeply into all three of these crises. And so having a space where men can be vulnerable and talk about their needs. So yeah, I would never make people feel guilty, because it's so powerful to care and to put your caring into something. And we're just saying, if you have the time, here are some ways actually that will make you feel even more empowered. And Matt, maybe you can pop into the chat. We made a video with the David Suzuki Foundation, where these young people talk about what it felt like to speak at city council, to speak at the others places. And you can just see they've been transformed. That getting to do that, they were just like, this, I have hope, and now I have to share it with everyone. And I didn't realize how powerful this was. And so, yeah, that's how I think about the two.
Angela?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's, Grace's point about not making people feel bad they're guilty is really important. And my focus is on the work related to equity and anti-racism. I think what's really important for us, though, is to think through the distinction between blame and responsibility, because those are two distinct concepts. And so maybe we're not to blame as individuals, but we do have a responsibility, both individually and collectively. And so that's really how I've tried to kind of approach the dialogue. And I think responsibility also, if you have responsibility to take something up, it also means you've got the capacity and the power to do that. So it really should be about building the confidence to be able to make the changes that are important. And then on the individual versus the collective or the systems, I think the point is about the kind of ability to synthesize to two is really essential, because if we think only that systems change matters, well, systems as a whole are tied to institutions and policies, and those have neglected a wide berth of interest. So if we're waiting for systems to change, by and large, we're cutting out from participation a huge range of people whose voices and insights are desperately needed. So there has to be space for individual action and contributions.
One of the questions that we were contemplating as a panel pre-getting together was this conversation around bringing these current issues, historical issues together. Human rights, well-being, sustainability, the environment, anti-racism movements, and say, wow, can we leverage these? Can we leverage these issues together so that we can make them move forward in a much more efficient fashion? And I recall us having maybe perhaps a difference of opinion about the ability to leverage multiple issues. For example, when I hear the collective impact, it's multiple agencies moving together to put pressure on a single issue. But are we talking about bringing together multiple issues and attempting to move that forward? My only concern is that sometimes when we try to do the all lives matter approach, it dilutes the effort, right? And some groups that have unique needs do not get served when we try to do all the issues in one bucket. However, I know that there are other ways to think about that and other opportunities, but I'm sure there are different groups who have concerns that when we lump everything together, their unique needs will not get addressed. How do we respond to that? How do you think about this unique moment we have? And how do we move human rights quantitatively forward in a global way? Because there are multiple human rights issues going on at the same time. Anyone want to jump in to start that off? Go ahead, Angela, you were last time, so how about you be first this time?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think it's really interesting and important. Some of the things that I had thought would be self-evident on some of these issues are not. So there's a real moment, I think, for pedagogy. So particularly over the summer, there was a huge conversation in regard to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement on our campus. And this is not a new conversation, of course, but it really was fueled in late May, early June through the summer. And we moved forward on an action plan to address anti-Black racism at McGill, which was really important, both in terms of its development, as well as its establishment, and now on its implementation. And many questions came forward about, okay, this is important, but why not just anti-racism, right? Or why not just equity? And you know, there was a real need for teaching and learning, and a lot of this goes back to knowing history and knowing contemporary realities. Not only if you kind of show demographic numbers in terms of the sheer underrepresentation of Black faculty, students, and staff at our university, but also the experiences of these folks once they're on the campus. And so that really was important, and that in of itself these are tough conversations to have. And again, they call for that listening. They call for the coming to the table where you're there to make space, unless you are a member of these groups, to listen and learn and be open. And this is a really important moment for that to happen, but it takes a huge amount of energy and sensitivity to get people even to come to the conversation, I would say. It's quite tough, at least in my experience. And I think the sustainability of it, right? So there was a moment of galvanized energy in the middle part of this calendar year. And so the question for me is sustaining that and making sure that it remains a fundamental issue in the years to come. This is not an issue that's going to be addressed in this particular year. So I think that's been really important. And I think people get very, very nervous with the term equity, diversity, and inclusion, because it becomes, you know, synonymous for the promotion of white women in positions of leadership, to be perfectly honest. And they're very nervous that it can be kind of cloaked to essentially like canvas a lot of things at once, where in fact there's a dilution of the voices where, you know, potentially they would have a moment to foreground interests that are quite unique and have never really been at the center of the table. And it gets lost simply because we have something that sounds great, difficult to challenge. So nobody can contest the idea of equity, but in fact, it can actually be used as a silencer.
Matt?
Yeah, I think this is certainly not my expertise area in coming from more of the environmental side of sustainability, but I think it's really interesting if we explore some really key, tangible examples on the campus that are relevant for every university. And two that come to mind that you know, even within Waterloo, we've had some internal conversations are something like our food systems that we have, and these have certainly a sustainability layer to them, a well-being layer to them, and an equity layer to them. And we can define those in many different ways and talk about them through many different lenses. So I come at that cautiously, but when we think about our food system and an affordability lens to something like that as well, these are maybe micro topics that touch on these macro themes in very different ways. And so it's bringing that lens to the decisions that are made on something like our campus food system, or maybe our campus transportation system. How do we empower people to get to and from the university or college in different ways? Those have certainly a sustainability and equity and a well-being lens to every aspect of that. And so the idea of multi-solving, I mean, we could come at that from a very strictly speaking sustainability lens or climate or environmental lens that might actually have negative consequences for certain groups, or we can make sure that we're providing that in an equitable way. I mean, we could, you know, conceivably do that in a few different frameworks. And so I really appreciate the idea of bringing multiple lenses to those types of challenges. And very often they actually do start pointing at some of those similar barriers and those similar directions that the campus can and should be moving in. You know, we do presentations with staff and faculty and students on the idea of healthy and sustainable food systems. And so often the answers are starting to point in the same direction. And of course, then you start chasing down. And here's another point on you know, something that Dr. Ono presented at the beginning. How far down the line do we go if we scope strictly speaking on what the impact is to our own campus population? But what about the supply chain and the community impact and everything beyond the university borders? You know, food systems have a hugely inequitable global footprint. And as we start chasing that down further, the changes that we can make on campus in a relatively small way can have huge global impact and benefits or consequences.
Go ahead, Grace.
Awesome. Yeah, really appreciating this conversation. I just saw Zabine pop something in the chat that I thought was really important, which is just like, who is already doing this labor on campus? And studies show time and time again that it's folks of color, and particularly women of color or non-binary folks or queer folks of color. And so I just want to keep returning with tangible examples at the university of how you genuinely empower students and listen to them, because I think our students at the beginning were an incredible example that students understand these issues only as deeply connected. They've never been raised in a world where they're not. I've never not thought of justice when I think of the quote unquote environment, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous language revitalization, supporting Indigenous folks on the front line, UN DRIP have all been a deep part of my climate work with other young folks. And the sense that Anjali said that we don't feel like we have a future. So well-being and hope and all of these things are so deeply, urgently put in how we do this, and who's going to see the gaps at a university in a society. And this is the point I keep trying to make over and over and over again in climate justice spaces. It's young folks, and it's especially young folks of color or other marginalized groups, because the systems don't work for them and they aren't creating a livable just future for them. And so they see, they're already there, they see these different futures, and they're so beautiful. They're so beautiful, these futures that intertwine disability justice and Indigenous sovereignty, and they have them. And so how are we really deeply listening? And I think one answer to Zabine's question is these folks need to be paid for their time or given academic credit or given some other recognition for what they're doing. Otherwise, they won't be able to, because these folks are already working on top of school doing this other emotional labor. Something that I think President Ono has done incredibly well, and it would be amazing if other universities replicated, is that he's just met with us over and over and over again to build that trust between us. So I've always said, let's have the board get together with the student activists and just don't talk about the controversy. Who are you as people? Can you trust each other? Can you hear what this person is worried about and what they have on their plate? And just get to know each other, because I think that's what happened. President Ono got to know us as people, as did Gail Murphy, as did Ainsley. And then it was a lot easier to start having these conversations like, I get that we're challenging lots of things that are happening. Here's where we're coming from. Okay, I get that these things are not possible, but where do we come together around the answers? And then I just would so encourage you to invest in youth climate justice leadership on your campus. I just think if you're going to invest in anything, just how generative, how multi-solving, how taking on all of these issues you'd get, because well-being, you're investing in climate justice leaders is deeply investing in well-being. And then climate justice leaders, I have no inherent interest in climate change. I wouldn't be studying it if it wasn't the greatest exacerbator of every other human rights issue of this time. Like, that's what I study. How do we have just answers to systemic injustices? So COVID fit perfectly right back into my mindset, because it's just the next great exacerbator. And this is the same for other youth climate justice organizers. And we're so used to taking our steps for collective good that it was youth climate people who are leading on the public health, who are keeping their friends and family home during lockdown, who created the mutual aid groups. It was two UBC climate justice folks who created the largest mutual aid group in Vancouver a week into the pandemic, because just having that frame, you can easily just switch and build hope and agency around the next biggest systemic issue and build community. Who's been building community in the face of a terrifying future for a long time? Young climate justice. Who's been organizing around the world through screens? And who isn't siloed at universities? Students, we interact with other students, other faculties, disciplines. We're all across the campus. We're this connective tissue. We're learning about all of these things. They're all on our radar. And so I think there's so much to be gained, but you can't tokenize young folks, and you really cannot tokenize young folks of color. You have to actually listen to them. Once you bring them there, you have to pay them or respect them for their time. And I think having something like the hub, it's confusing, it's new, it's a different place. And oh, and even to just talk about how we're connected, we have our student staff working with Wellbeing, Campus and Community Planning, the University Sustainability Initiative, and the Center for Community Engaged Learning, so that we can already just be in the midst of all those places. And Wellbeing have been such incredible champions of us and have really understood that thousands and thousands and thousands of students on campus, climate justice, and watching all this suffering and watching all this is just a huge mental health burden. And so feeling like they can be leaders on this and take action is just such a well-being boost. So just if you're going to invest in a mug share program, I would urge you, not that that's not important, but I promise you, if you invest in climate justice leaders, they'll do that too. You know, they'll bring it in with them.
Jennifer, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, you guys have done a good job carrying on the conversation. You really didn't need me here, but I guess as the timekeeper, as we start to wrap up, are there any final comments that any one of you want to make that you haven't made already? Or any calls to action for people on the line?
The comment that I would like to add at the end is we didn't get enough time to talk about the Okanagan Charter and the work of the charter. The intention of the charter is to embed health information in all aspects of the work that we do. I think it's a perfect example of collective impact. It is embedding, you know, something that we can all focus on, something that we all agree to. There are some common standards, and then we make sure every university policy and action and decision and program and service that we take a health and well-being question as we begin to think about new student orientation, parking, dining, housing, affordability, that health and well-being becomes part of the conversation. And that's completely different in how universities typically have made decisions. That's why I'm so glad to see so many universities join the Okanagan Charter to be about creating a mindset around health and well-being. I think it's extremely important, and it is the definition of collective impact. But the next generation of our work, we've moved from, you know, student engagement, student activity, student leadership, is really about student health. The student health imperative is critically important, and the Okanagan Charter, I think, is the framework for that work. So I hope that all of the universities listening today would consider, as many universities have, how to engage the Okanagan Charter as part of their work.
Great. So unless Angela or Matt or Grace, do you have any final comments before we move on? Grace?
I know I've spoken a lot. I want to say that UBC Wellbeing in particular, it seems like felt like they could really engage and support the hub because of the charter, that was really within their purview. And also just as I'm talking about Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous rights, Indigenous language revitalization, I always like to point out places where you could learn more. So one incredible group in Indigenous Climate Action is the kind of leading climate justice Indigenous-led group in what we call Canada. And then the Indigenous Law Research Unit at UVic is doing an incredible job of this work of revitalizing Indigenous law. And I think Indigenous law is going to be such a key piece of all of these things moving forward.
Great. Matt?
I think I'll just add one final thought on the end here, and that's the role of information and transparency in these processes, because embedding into decision making is only effective if actually people can understand how those decisions were made and the data or criteria or whatever that went into that discussion. And so whether that's conversations around racialized data versus aggregate data and understanding how that impact is different on different populations, or the impact that a particular decision will have on the institution or community's carbon footprint, or what, like, you can't make those decisions without actually bringing some transparency to the information that kind of undergirds them. So I would just encourage every institution as much as possible to be transparent with information on any one and all of these topics as much as is feasible, because that's not only going to help the decision making, but will also be critical to understanding whether you're actually being successful or not in any of this.
Great. So thank you so much for our panelists, both our staff members and our students. Thank you so much for your thoughtful, very authentic difficult conversations, but obviously very impactful. This won't be the last conversation. We hope to have more to come. So now I'm going to bring it back to the audience. Thank you for those that have stayed with us. Hopefully this has been well worth your time and have given you lots of thought to what role can you play back at your own institution. So I'm going to ask my colleague Melissa to pop up the Mentimeter. So we have a question to engage all of you. So if you haven't done this before, you open a separate internet browser, or you can open it on your phone, and you'll type in www.menti.com. And then when you get to that website, you'll enter the code. It's at the top of the screen there, 5934246. And a question should pop up there that asks, what will you do in your work to approach systemic racism, colonialism, well-being, and the climate emergency? So what has today's event made you think differently, how you can approach your work to these interrelated crises? So I'll just wait till some of the answers start to populate there. Maybe I'll give everyone another minute to put some answers in. So I'm seeing the first couple answers are really about investing in student leadership, engaging students, listening to students, connecting with peers, doing that with empathy, and finding more ways to support, empower, and give voice to our students. I see also empowering minority populations and challenging the status quo, engaging students in advocacy, and also, so again, student involvement coming up over and over again. And I see also working to identify systemic issues and acting to transform them. A couple answers there of humble listening. And again, people also saying multi-solving. So hopefully people learned a little bit more about that today. And I'm seeing, yeah, multi-solving and getting people to connect beyond the silos. And maybe traditionally our post-secondary institutions are not structured that way. And maybe we have to think about how to do that work differently with the silos that we currently have, and maybe even breaking down some of those silos. So we will, this is something we're going to continue in the breakout rooms for those that are joining us. For those that are not joining us, and this is sort of the end of the event for you, we are going to be sending out these answers. So not to worry if you want to read what others have said. I just want to make note also that today's virtual dialogue is the first in a series that are being brought to you by University of British Columbia, University of Waterloo, McGill, and the Canadian Health Promoting Campuses Network. So please definitely stay tuned and look at your inbox for more to come. So again, what's going to happen now, because we're in a webinar format, to join breakout rooms, we actually have to go into another Zoom meeting. So we're going to pop in the Zoom chat box there, the link that if you're joining us for a breakout room, you're going to click on that link. Just give me a minute. And then you'll be zoomed away. You'll meet my colleague Karen in another room, and she will break us out into rooms with further discussion questions. Again, if you're leaving us now, we really want to thank you for joining us. Please take care of yourself, stay safe. And we hope to see you again. So thank you all, and you can now go to the link there and be zoomed away. Have a good afternoon, everyone.